Hello and welcome to our next section, which is all about arrays. So in JavaScript, arrays are probably the most used data structure. So we use arrays all the time, and therefore JavaScript has countless modern array methods, which we can also imagine as array tools. So in this section, we will learn all about these tools, so how to use them, and even more importantly, when to use them. And we will do that while building our next beautiful project, so that you can immediately apply all these array tools to a real-world situation. So let's go do that. Welcome back. Let's begin this section with a couple of very simple and very easy to understand array methods, just to expand our array toolkit a little bit more. And as always, at the beginning of a new section, make sure to grab your starter files and open them up in VS Code. So that's the folder called Arrays Bankist. And then open up script.js, which is going to contain a lot of stuff here. But for now, don't worry about any of that. I will explain what all of this is and also what else we have in our starter files in a couple of videos from here. All right. So up there we have the application part for the app we're going to build in this section. And then here we have the lectures part, which is a bit more for the concepts themselves. And by the way, this yellow part here comes from a VS Code extension that I use. And I think I showed it to you in the beginning. But anyway, let's not talk about array methods. Now, before we start, let's quickly talk about why arrays do actually have methods. Well, remember that methods are simply functions that we can call on objects. So basically, they are functions attached to objects. So if we have array methods, that means that arrays themselves are also objects. And so these array methods are simply functions that are attached to all arrays that we create in JavaScript. Now, we will learn why all arrays have access to these methods in a later section when we talk about prototypal inheritance. But for now, I just want you to understand that arrays are objects and that they get access to special built-in methods that we can essentially see as tools for arrays. And so, as I mentioned in this lecture, we're going to start by learning some very simple tools that we can use on arrays. So let's start by defining a simple test array that we can work with. And I will make it as simple as possible, just with these letters, because that will help us understand some of the things we're going to do here. All right, the first method we're going to talk about is the slice method. And this one is very similar to the slice method that's available on strings. Remember? So with the slice method, we can extract part of any array, but without changing the original array. So essentially, we can take a slice of an array, and so that's why it's called slice. So array.slice, and now just like in strings, we have the begin parameter. And so this is the index at which we will start extracting. So when we say 2 here, we should start extracting here at C, and then all the way to the end. Okay? And then this slice method will return a new array. And so we need to log that to the console in order to actually see it. Okay? So as I said, this does not mutate the original R array. Okay? Instead, it returns a new array, so a copy of the array, but only with the extracted parts. So let's open up a terminal here again, and live server. And here we go. So this is already our Bankist page, but nothing is going to work here yet. So for now, let's just open up the console, because that's really all we are interested in for now. Let's reload here again, And so now we indeed get this array, which is a slice of the original array starting at position number 2. So 0, 1, and 2, right? Now, of course, we can also define the end parameter. So when we write 2 and 4, then let's see the result here. And so what this means is that just like in strings, the end parameter here is not included in the output. So index 4 is this one here. And so, yeah, as I just mentioned, this one is then not going to be included in the output. So 2 to 4 is really just 2 and 3. Okay? And so the length of the outputting array here will be the end parameter minus the beginning one. And so that's exactly the length we get here. Okay? Then next, again, just like in strings, we can define a negative begin parameter, and then it will start to copy from the end of the array. So -1 will basically take the last two elements of the array, so D and E. And so with this, it's pretty easy to simply get the last element of any array. So if we just duplicate this, so -1 is always just the last element of any array. So this is a very nice trick that's sometimes useful. And now to make this complete, we can also use a negative index as the end parameter. So let's start extracting at position number 1 until -1, basically. So let's see, that returns B and C, and that's because it now starts extracting at position 1, which is here, and it extracts everything except the last two here. So that's what the -2 here means. All right, and if you find this a bit confusing, then just experiment a little bit more with this. Now finally, we can use the slice method to simply create a shallow copy of any array. So to do that, we simply call it without any arguments at all, and then indeed we get here the exact same array. And if you remember it correctly, we already did something similar in one of the previous sections, but using the spread operator. Remember? So back then we did this, so creating a new array and then expanding the original array into that. And so that gives us the exact same result. So the question is, should you use the spread operator or the slice method in order to create a shallow copy? Well, that's actually entirely up to you. So it's just a matter of personal preference. The only time you really need to use the slice method here is when you want to chain multiple methods together, so calling one after the other. And we will do that, of course, later in this section. All right, so that is the slice method. Next up is a method with a very similar name, which is called splice. And the splice method works in almost the same way as slice, but the fundamental difference is that it does actually change the original array. So it mutates that array. So let's again log the result to the console anyway, but now we use splice, and then with the same argument as we used before here. And so the result here looks exactly the same. So this one here is the same as this first one. Let's give it even more space here. But now watch what happened to our original array. And we see that all that remains here in our original array is the first two elements. And so now the extracted elements are actually gone from the original array. So splice deleted them. And so what we can see is that splice actually does mutate the original array. So it takes part of the array and returns it, and then the original array itself loses this part that was extracted. Now in practice, most of the time the value that the splice method returns doesn't even interest us. all we are usually interested in is to just delete one or more elements from an array using splice. And one pretty common use case is to simply remove the last element of an array. So let's actually do that here. So let's say r.splice and then -1. So just like in the slice method, -1 here is the last element. Okay, so the begin and end parameters works exactly the same as in the slice method. Let's now just get rid of this one here so that we see our original array. And so indeed, as we log here r to the console, it is the original array except for the last element, which was e. So that's exactly what we did here. All right. And as always, in case you want to learn more about any particular method, for example, you can always use the MDN documentation. So let's say MDN array splice. So this one. And so now here are some more examples on how to use this. And so you have the name of the parameters. And actually, the second parameter is called delete count. So it's actually not the begin parameter. So it works a little bit different than in the slice method. So let me just show that to you. So going back here. So if we do .splice, let's say at position number 1, and then we want to take exactly 2 elements. And so then we write 2. Okay. And so the result now of the resulting array, it should be that B and C are deleted. Okay, and so indeed, only A and D now remain. Let's log R to the console here to see the process a little bit better. So here we removed the first one, and then here we went to position 1 and extracted or deleted 2 elements. And so position 1 and then 2 elements. Okay, so this first parameter here works the same as in the slice method, but the second one is really the number of elements that we want to delete. All right, so that is splice. Next up, we're going to talk about reverse. So that's a very simple one. Let's just restore our array here at this part so that we can work with the original one here. Or actually, let's also create a new array here. Let's call this one R2. And here we will have 5 more letters of the alphabet, but this time in a wrong order. So let's say for some reason we are working with this array and we need to reverse it. And so that's exactly what we use reverse for. So R2.reverse, and indeed it now returns the reversed array. Here I actually want F, and so now it is correct. So F, G, H, I, J. But now what's important to note here is the fact that the reverse method does actually mutate the original array. So you see, as we log the original, it is now reversed too. Okay, so this one here does mutate the array. So that's important to keep in mind. So maybe you're noticing that in each of the methods, I always mention which one mutates and which one does not mutate the original array. And that's because this is a very important characteristic of each of these methods. That's because in a certain situation, we might not want to mutate the original array, and then we cannot use any of these methods. Okay. Next up is the concat method. And so this one is used to concatenate 2 arrays. So let's create a variable called letters. And letters will be the result of calling the concat method on array. And here we have to specify the second array. So let's take a look. And now we have the 10 first letters of the alphabet here. So the first array will be the one on which the method is called, and the second one is the one that we pass into the concat method. And once again, we already did this before in another way, remember? So we could simply also do this, right? R and then R2. This gives us the exact same result, and it also does not mutate any of the involved arrays. So just like concat, which also doesn't mutate the original array here. All right. And finally, just the join method that we already talked about before, but just for the sake of completion here, right? And by the way, here in this concat method, so if you prefer to do this one, it's of course perfectly fine. And once again, it is just a matter of personal preference, whether you prefer to use the spread operator or the concat method. All right. And now here, let's just join all the letters of the alphabet together that we have here in our array by using this separator here. Okay, and so as you already know, the result here is a string with the separator that we specified. Great. So your array toolset is rapidly growing here. And remember that you already know push, unshift, pop, shift, index of, and includes from the intro section. Now, if you ever lose track of all these different methods and how they work, you can always come back to these videos, or of course, check the documentation on MDN, just like we did here. So no developer in the world knows all of this by heart. So sometimes I even have to look up how the splice or the slice method works, because it's just too many methods to keep track of. And yeah, it's very hard to know everything by heart. But anyway, let's now move on to the next lecture, where we will take array methods to a whole new level. There's a new, very simple array method in ES 2022, which is the add method. And so let's take a look at it. And let's start by creating some dummy array. So 23, 11, 64. So just 3 random values here. And then if we wanted to take one of the values out of the array, let's say the first one, then we would traditionally do this, right? So array at position 0. So that's basically what this means. But now with the new add method, we can do the exact same thing using a method. And as you can guess, that is the add method. Then we specify the exact same index here, and then we get the exact same value. So basically now we do what we say here. So here we say array at position 0. And so that's why this new method is called array.add_position 0. So very, very simple, right? So basically we can now replace the traditional bracket notation with the more modern looking add method if we prefer to use array methods like this. Now, maybe this doesn't look all too useful. So what's the big deal here? Well, actually there is one particularity of the add method which makes it quite useful to use instead of the brackets notation. So let's now say that we wanted to get the last element of the array. Now, supposing that we do not know the length of the array, we would write something like this. So array at the position of array.length minus 1. And that will then give us 64. So array.length is the length of the array, which is 3, but the last position here is position number 2, because the array is 0 based. So the indexes are 0 based. So 0, 1, 2. And so therefore, whenever we want to get the last element of an array, we always subtract 1 from the length. So this is quite a common scenario in JavaScript, and that's why there's also another solution. So another way is to use the slice method that we just learned before. So r.slice, and with this we can then get a copy of the original array. And here we can use -1 to get the last element of the array, right? So just like we learned in the previous lecture. So here we get that copy of the array only with the last element. So of course we want the value, and so then we need to take out that first value by doing square brackets 0. All right. So these are the two more traditional ways of solving the problem of getting the last element. However, as you can probably guess, the new add method makes this process even easier. So now all we have to do is to write r.add, and now here we can write the exact same negative indexes that we can write in the slice method. And so if we log this now, then here again we have 64. So the negative index, just like in slice, basically starts counting from the right side here, so from the end of the array. And so we could also write -2. So -1 and -2. So this should give us 11, and indeed, here is that 11. But most of the time, the thing that we're most interested in here is this -1 to get the last element of the array. And that's actually it. Now the only question is, should you use this new add method, or should you keep using the bracket notation? Well, as always, it depends. So if you want to get the last element of an array, or basically start counting from the end of an array, then you should probably start using the add method. Also, if you want to do something called method chaining, which we will talk about later in this section, then the add method is also perfect for that. So basically combining multiple methods all at the same time. And then it's quite helpful to use the add method instead of the brackets notation. Now, on the other hand, if you just want to quickly get a value from an array, so just like the first element, then of course you can keep using the brackets notation. And personally, I also do that all the time. So basically, if all you want to do is something like this, then you can simply keep using these square brackets. Okay. Oh, and by the way, I actually also wanted to let you know that the add method also works on strings. So let's log to the console a string, let's say Jonas, and then here we can also use the add method. For example, let's say at 0, and so that will give us J. And then, of course, we can also get the last character of the string by using at -1. In this lecture, we will loop over an array using the for each method. Now, we had already learned how to loop over an array using the for of loop, but the for each method is really fundamentally different. And from now on, we will start working with our bank account data, but still in a very simplified way. So let me get this data here into the present lecture so that we can see what we're actually working with. So let me comment it out from here and just move it here. So let's say that we wanted to loop over this movements array in order to print a message for each movement in this bank account. So these positive values here are basically deposits, and the negative values are withdrawals. And so we can print something to the console saying whether the user deposited or withdrew some money. And let's actually start by doing this using a for of loop, just so that we can then compare the for each loop to this one. So let's create a variable movement of movements, and then we will log something to the console according to the movement value. So basically, if the current movement is greater than 0, then log to the console you deposited and then the movement, and else you withdrew and then the movement again. And actually we can use a nice math function here, which is to take the absolute value. So basically removing the sign. So let's see. And yeah, that looks nice. So of course this solution here works perfect. But now let's finally learn how to use the for each method to achieve the exact same thing, but in my opinion, in an easier way. So to loop over the movements array, we use for each, and that's with a capital E, don't forget that. And then the for each method actually requires a callback function here. So for each is technically a higher order function, as we learned in the last section, which requires a callback function in order to tell it what to do. So it's the for each method here that will call this callback function. We are not calling it ourselves, as always. And that's, of course, important to keep in mind once again. But when exactly will for each actually call this callback function? Well, what the for each method does is to loop over the array, and in each iteration, it will execute this callback function here. Also, as the for each method calls this callback function in each iteration, it will pass in the current element of the array as an argument. And so we can specify that here. And let's call it again movement. So again, each time this callback here is called, so in each iteration, it will receive the current element of the array as an argument. And here we can, of course, give this any name that we want, but I'm just calling it movement because that's what we did up here. And so now we can do exactly the same thing here in this callback function. Let's give it a save. And indeed, we now get the same result twice. So let me just add like a separator here for each. And so, yeah, indeed, we get the same result. We can also get ourselves more space. And yeah, so that's essentially how the for each method works. So basically behind the scenes, in iteration 0, it will call this function here. So an anonymous function in this case without a name. But let's just call it function. And it's going to call it with the value of 200. Then in the next iteration, it will call it with the value of 450. Then with the value of 400, right? And so on and so forth until it reaches the end of the array. And this part of the for each function passing in the current element of the array, here like this, this, and this, is especially important to understand. So basically, this is exactly the concept that I explained in the last section when I said that we use a callback function to tell another higher order function exactly what it should do. And so in this case, we tell for each that in each iteration, it should log one of these two strings here to the console. So we give the for each method instructions by giving it a callback function which contains these instructions. All right? And I really know and understand that this is quite a hard concept to wrap your head around. But if you just continue using this from now on, then eventually it will start to make sense, believe me. Now, anyway, which of the two versions do you think is cleaner and easier to write and easier to read? Well, I think that we can both agree that it is the for each method, right? And maybe you don't agree with that. And of course, that's okay. As I keep mentioning, it's always good to develop your own style of programming. But using the for each method here, and especially understanding the logic behind it here with the callback function, is still really important for all the other methods that we're going to learn later. Anyway, let's now learn some more stuff about the for each method, because we are not done yet. So what if we actually needed access to a counter variable here? So just like we can access the current index of the array here in the for off loop. So remember how we did that with for off. So let's just rewrite this part. So in this case, we loop over movements.entries, remember? So entries is in fact just another array method, and it returns an array of arrays, remember, which in the first position contains the current index and then the value itself. And so this is how we access the counter variable in the for off loop. And then here in our string, we could use that to say, for example, movement, and then the number of the movement. So that's the counter which starts at 0. And so we just add 1 to that. And so, well, something went wrong. So that's in line 1 to 1. So unexpected token. Oh, and that's because we didn't open it here again. So we were missing this part here. And now this looks a lot nicer with the number of the movement here. And so let's now do the same in the for each method here. And here, fortunately, it's a lot easier to get access to the current index. So to understand how it works, we need to remember once more that it is the for each method who calls this callback function in each iteration. And as it calls this function, it also passes in the current element of the array. But actually, that's not all it passes in. In fact, for each passes in the current element, the index, and the entire array that we are looping. And so, therefore, we can specify them here in our parameter list. So let's say index and array. Now, of course, we can just use one like we have been doing, or we can just use two, or we can use all three together. And as always, the names here do not matter at all, but what does matter is the order. So the first parameter always needs to be the current element, the second parameter always the current index, and the third one always the entire array that we are looping over. Because that's the order in which the arguments, so the actual values, are passed into our callback function. Okay, so now let's just copy this here so we can do the same here, give it a save, and here we called it index and not I. And in fact, in the real world, we actually use shorter names. So let's just call this one I, this one R, and this one here MOV, which is just a shorter abbreviation of movements. And so this is quite a common pattern to just abbreviate a little bit. So let's replace these three here with MOV. Give it a save, and now it does look the same as with the for off method. But I hope you can see that it's a lot easier to get the current index here in for each. Just notice that the order of the parameters is different in both these scenarios. So in for each, the first value here is the current element, and the second one is the index. While when we use here the entries in the for off loop, then the first element is the index, and the second value is the current array element. So just don't forget that here in this case. So always first the current element and then the index. Okay, and this is how we loop over arrays with the for each method. Now, when should you use for each and when should you use the for off loop? Well, one fundamental difference between the two of them is that you cannot break out of a for each loop. So the continue and break statements do not work in a for each loop at all. So instead, for each will always loop over the entire array, and there is nothing that you can do about it. So if you really need to break out of a loop, then you have to keep using the for off loop. But other than that, it really comes down to your personal preference, just like so many other things in JavaScript. So every programming language always has many different ways or different tools to achieve the same thing. And especially as more things keep getting added to the language, there will always be more options to achieve the same result. All right, and with this, we wrap up this lecture. So in my opinion, this is a really brilliant and powerful mechanism, but I know that it's also rather complex to wrap your head around this, isn't it? And it actually took quite some time for me to fully understand this myself. So back in the day. So please don't become frustrated with this. It will all become obvious with the practice. So just keep using this and then you will be fine. Once you do understand exactly how this works, so especially this mechanism of the callback and of the passing arguments into this callback here, so once you understand this fundamental mechanism, then working with all other array methods in this section will become really easy, because most of them follow the exact same principle of the callback function that we just explored here. So please review this lecture carefully, and yeah, if you really understand the role of the callback function here, then just move on to the next video. See you there. So we learned about the for each method on arrays. However, for each is also available on maps and sets. And so let's take a small detour now and see how for each works with maps and with sets. And we're going to start with maps. And for that, let's cut this currencies map that we have up here. All right. And remember that in this array of arrays, each of these array elements, so this inner array, will be one entry of the map, where this here is the key and this is the value. All right. And so we can call for each also on a map. So for each, and then again the callback function. And now this callback function also has 3 parameters. So when the for each method calls it, it will call this function with 3 arguments. So the first one will be the current value. So the current value in the current iteration. The second one is the key. And the third one is the entire map that is being looped over. And so you see, this is similar to the array, where in the array, the first parameter is the current element of the array, the second one is the index, and the third is the entire array. And so there's a nice correspondence between these. And so this is quite easy to memorize here. And so let's just log a very quick string here. So this is not really that important, but I wanted to show you that for each also exists on these 2 new data structures. Okay, and indeed, it worked. So we got the key of each of the map entries and then also the value. All right, and so now let's try the same with a set. So this is with a map and this is now with a set. So let's create currencies unique, let's say. So new set. And remember that in here, we need to pass an iterable. And so I will use an array here. So let's just create a couple of strings here, another US dollar, and then some euros. Let's just take a look. And indeed, it only has the unique values. So just as expected. And so let's now call for each on this set as well. So currencies unique dot for each. And now once again, the callback function has the parameters of value, key, and map. And we will see in a second if that actually makes sense. So let's log to the console. Actually, the same thing as here. So let's see what's going to happen. So remember, we are logging the key and the value. Okay. But now we get USD, USD. And here, GBP, GBP. And so what this means is that the key here is exactly the same as the value. So why is that? Well, a set doesn't have keys, right? And it doesn't have indexes either. And so there is no value that would make sense for the key. All right. So essentially this key here makes no sense at all. It wouldn't even have to be there. And so the people who designed this for each method for sets, they could have simply omitted the second argument, right? Well, if they did that, then this for each would have been different from the others. And so that would then create confusion in developers. And therefore it was decided to keep the same signature. So basically to keep the same three parameters in this callback function and simply to set the second one to the first one. So we can just write value here as well, just to avoid that confusion. All right. Oh, and of course, we cannot have the duplicate parameter name. And so we can just use an underscore, which in JavaScript means a throwaway variable. So that means a variable that is completely unnecessary. So it's just a convention, which we will see again a little bit later. Okay, and so now it should work. And yeah, that's all you need to know about the for each method for maps and sets. So it's very straightforward if you already understood how it works for arrays. In this lecture, it's time to take a first look at the application that we're going to build in this section. We will also take a closer look at the starter files for this project, and we will also check out the flowchart for this application. So let's get started. And this is the application that we will build throughout this section and also the next one. So it's called Bankist. And this is here the demo version that is actually live on bankist.netlify.app. So I invite you to actually try out this application together with me as you watch this video. So to get a real good feeling for how it all works. Now this looks a little bit empty. And so you can just basically log in. So write JS and then the pin is 1111. And so Bankist stands for minimalist banking. And so this is why we have this kind of banking, so an online bank interface. So we have all the movements here. We have the overall balance of the account up here. Then we have some summary data down here. And here on the right side, we have three options that we can do. So we can transfer money to someone else. We can request a loan from the bank and we can close the account. So let's request a loan here. Let's say I need 1,000 euros. So I click here and then after some time it is approved and it appears here as a deposit. Okay, then I can also transfer money and there is a user called GD and let's say I want to transfer 5,000. So let's try that. And so now I have 5,000 less than I used to have. Finally, we can also sort these here. So now they are sorted and now they are back to normal. And now let's go to that other account, JD, with the pin of 2222. And so let's check out if she has a deposit of 5,000. And indeed, here it is. We also see that this account here is in US dollars and with the American formatting, while the other one was in euros. And so that's something that we're going to take care of in the next section. But in this section, we will actually take care of displaying all of these movements, making these operations here possible, calculating the statistics, as well as the current balance. And so, yeah, I think it's going to be a lot of fun. And I'm really, really happy with this application. I think it looks amazing. It also looks like a real world use case. And yeah, overall, this is a great project for training arrays, because we can do lots of the stuff that you see here on the screen using arrays. Great. So now that you have a feeling for how this application works, let's take a look at a flowchart that I designed or that I built for this application. So here is that flowchart for the Bankist application. And just like before in the pick game, I built this one based on the flow of actions that we just saw in that live version of the Bankist application. So starting there in the top left, as the user logs in, which is one of these yellow actions. So all of these yellow elements here mean some sort of action. So when the login action is performed, we check for the correct credentials, and if they are correct, we display the UI, and then we also update the UI. And so that means to calculate the balance, calculate the summary, display the movements, and then later on in the next section, we will also start and display a logout timer. So all of this here happens right at the beginning as the user logs in. And so actually this part in the beginning here, everything that is inside the update UI will be the first thing that we will do. Okay, then from there, we will implement the kind of fake login, and then we will take care of these other operations. So probably we will come back to this flowchart by then. But anyway, this is already a very good overview of all the steps that we have to implement in order to build this application. And you can spend some more time on this and actually compare it to the functionality of the application. That's why, one more time, I included this flowchart in the starter files of this section. Now this time, just like in the pick game, I built this flowchart myself, because all that matters here in this project is to build this application and learn all about arrays. But in the next big project, we will actually plan the entire application together, and I will show you all the steps that we have to go through in order to come up with a flowchart like this. So don't worry about designing a flowchart just yet. We will learn how it works and how to plan an application from the ground up. But for now, again, my purpose with this flowchart is just to give us a good overview, so a good roadmap to actually go ahead and implement all the features of this application. And so then whenever we get lost, we can always just come back to this flowchart and see exactly how the application works and what we have left to implement. Okay, but with that being said, let's now go back to our code editor and take a closer look at all the starter files that we have there. So right at the top of our script, we have these 4 account objects. Okay, and so this one here was the JS that I just showed you in the demo. And so here then are the movements stored in that object. We also have the pin, and later on we will also use this interest rate. Okay, now of course in the real world you would want much more data about each of the movements, not just the value, right? For example, we would use the date of each movement, maybe a description, and so on. But here we really just want to work with arrays. And so I'm keeping it very simple, but still at the same time fun to build. Okay. So yeah, so one object for each account. And you could ask, why not use a map instead of an object? Well, the thing is that we're going to pretend that all this data is coming from a web API. So a little bit like we talked about earlier. And whenever we get data from an API, this data usually comes in the form of objects. And so this is why we have objects here. And then finally, an array containing all these account objects in there. Remember that this is one of the most common ways of organizing data in JavaScript applications. And so that's why we are going to use it throughout this section to make this actually feel a bit more like a real-world application. All right. So that's the data. Let's take a look here a little bit at the other files. So as always, we have the prettier configuration. Then here's the flowchart that I just showed you. And so here you can take a look at it by yourself. Then the index.html, and this one is a lot more complex now, and we will actually need it to take some code out of there. Then here we have the icon and the logo. So like this icon you see here in the tab, so the fav icon. And finally we have the style. And so here you can have some fun and learn some CSS if you're interested in it. So it's almost like 300 lines of code, I think, that I built to style this application. So you see, I really put a lot of work to make this application really fun. Okay. So I think that's it for the starter files. Just notice that I already selected all of the elements that we're gonna need. So you see, it's a lot of stuff, and I'm gonna explain what each of this is. But what matters is that this way, we don't have to write all of this code ourselves. And so this makes development a little bit faster. So a lot of elements here. And yeah, so I think that's it for this video. I think you got a good overview of this project for this section. And once again, please go ahead and take a look at this URL by yourself and use user.js and pin 1111. And then when you're familiar with how the application works, then let's move on. In this video, we're finally going to be back to DOM manipulation. And we're going to learn a couple of DOM manipulation techniques, and we will use them together with the for each method that we just learned about. So this is really exciting stuff, so let's get started. And to start, let's actually open up the HTML and CSS files, and we will then keep them open here throughout this project. And I like to have the script always the last. Now in the HTML, we have this navigation bar, so this nav element, which is all of this top part. And then after that, we have the main element. And so that's basically the entire application. And that part is right now invisible. And so that's because here in the CSS, so in line 87, we have the app selector and the opacity is set to 0. And so we need to comment that. And for that, we can, as always, use command / give it a save, and then we can finally see the application here. All right. So logging in and out of this application is essentially just changing this opacity here. And so now the opacity is basically back to 100 because now we commented it out. And so 100 is the default. But anyway, let's go back to our script here. And so what we want to do now is to basically display these movements right here in the application, here in this list. So in this container. So for each movement, we want one element like this, okay? And we will be able to do that because of the for each method, which will allow us to loop through this array, and then in each iteration, basically create an element like this and display it on the page. So this time, we're finally gonna move away from the console and actually do some DOM manipulation here. All right, so let's move down here after these elements, but still inside of the app part of this file, and then let's write our code. Now we could simply start writing our code out here in the global context. However, that is not a good practice. So whenever we do something like this, it's always best to create a function. So let's call this one print or a display. I prefer display. So display movements. And then we make this function receive the data with which it should actually work. So in this case, that's the movements. So we call this parameter movements because this function should receive one array of movements and then work with that data. So in this case, that's the movements that it should display in the user interface. All right. And so it's a good practice to pass the data into a function instead of, for example, having this function work with a global variable. That would work as well, but it's a lot better to pass that data directly into the function. Okay, so get used to that kind of approach. All right. So again, instead of working with global variables, start passing the data that a function needs actually into that function. So let me, as always, call this function first to see what we will get as an input. And so the movements that I will use here will come from this account1. So essentially, that's going to be this array. So account1.movements. So account1.movements. Okay, and so inside of this function, these movements are simply called movements. And so now let's loop over these movements using what we learned before. So for each, and then our callback function here. Now inside of this function, we need the current movement, and we also need the index. And that's because here actually I have them here number 1, number 2, and so basically we have the movements numbered like this. Okay, so starting with the first movement down and then adding the new ones on top. Okay, all right, so that's the easiest part. Now we have to essentially create an HTML that looks like this. So let's go to our HTML file and to actually take a look at what this HTML looks like. So we are inside our app element here basically. Then we have this movements element, which is all of this container here. And maybe it would be easier to actually see this in the console. So if we did this, maybe we can get rid of this part. Not really. But anyway, now we can see that all of this is the movements. And then in each movement, we have a movements row. So each of this is a movements row. Okay. And so let's now copy the entire code of one movements row, because this is what we want to create in each iteration of the loop with the current data. So essentially, let's take all of this. So I'm going to copy it. And let me now paste it here into a template string. So I will create a variable, which I'm going to call HTML. And then I'm creating a template literal. And template literals are amazing for creating HTML templates like the one we will create now. Because now it's really easy to create a multi-line string like this. Okay, let's just fix indentation here a little bit to make this then easier to understand. Okay, and now all we have to do is to basically replace the data that's not relevant, so this hard-coded data, with our actual movements data. Okay, now this part here of the date we will not do now. We will take care of this in the next section. So let's get rid of it. And then here we have the movements value. So this is formatted, but again, we will just use the plain value that's coming out of the array for now. And so now we can simply insert that here. And so that's mov, right? So mov is the current element in the array that we are looping over. And so in each iteration, that will then be one of the movements in the array. Then here we have toDeposit. And so we will have to check whether a certain movement is a deposit or a withdrawal. So let's delete that. And for now, we can add the number here. So you see 1, 2. And so for that, we now use the I. And so that's why we also needed the current index besides just the current value. Okay. And now we need a way to knowing if it's a deposit or a withdrawal. And so let's use a ternary operator, and let's do that out here as a separate variable, because we will need that twice. We will need it one to write it here on the user interface, but here also this class name depends on that. So you see that we have type deposit, so that's then this green color, and we have type withdrawal, and so that's then this red color. So we will need this information twice. And so let's just calculate it outside here. So I'm going to call it type. And so this is the same logic as before. So if the current movement is greater than 0, then the type should be deposit, or else it should then be withdrawal. Okay. And now let's write that here. So the type here, and again also here in the class name. So we can also basically construct this class name here, which is very useful too. And I hope here you can see that the template literal is really a lifesaver here. Okay, so we created our HTML template here. Now all we need to do is to find a way to actually adding this HTML onto the web page here. So we need to attach this HTML somehow into this container. So into this movements element, okay? And to do that, we will use a method called insert adjacent HTML. So that's gotta go right here. So let me first write the name of the method, and then I'm going to tell you where we actually have to attach this method to. So it's called insert adjacent HTML. And we are going to call this method on this movements element here. So this container onto which we want to add a new movements row element. So this element here on which we want to add a new movements row. Right? So we are looking for an element with the class of movements, and as I told you in the last lecture, I already selected all of these elements. And so in this case, it's this one, and so the name is container movements. Okay, so you see that I used kind of uniform names here. So I have container app for this entire application container and container movements. Then all the other ones are called label, so label welcome, date, and so on and so forth. Then the others are called button, and then all the input fields are all called input, and then whatever the name of them. So to keep it nice and easy to understand. But anyway, this one is called container movements. And so onto there, again, we call insert adjacent HTML. And this method accepts two strings. The first string is the position in which we want to attach the HTML. And this one I'm going to set to after begin, but there are more options. And I think the best way of showing it to you is actually in the documentation. So MDN. And so whenever I need to figure out something, this is how I do it. So I know that down here there is a visualization, and yeah. So these are the four options here. And the one we chose is after begin. So that's this one. So imagine that this P element here is our container movements. And so basically, I want to add new elements right after the beginning of this element. And so basically, I'm saying here that I want to insert the new child element right after the beginning of the parent element. So again, that's container movements. Then we have before end, which is at the end of the element, as the name says. And then we can even put it outside of the parent element. And then we could even put it outside of the container movements. And sometimes this is useful as well. But usually I always use after begin or before end. And once we see the result, I will explain a bit better why it is after begin and not before end. But anyway, let's go back here, because now we need to specify the second argument. And that is the string containing the HTML that we want to insert. And that's it. So if we now run this, it should already work. And yes, it does. So that's amazing. And let's check it out. And let's compare it with our values. And so indeed, the newest one is the last one here. And so that's element number 8. And it is indeed 1300, right? And it is indeed green because it is a deposit. So a positive number. The same with the 70, and then we have minus 130. And so indeed, that's a withdrawal. Beautiful. Now, if we scroll down here, we will see that we still have these two old ones. So basically the two that were already there. And that's because all we are doing is to add new elements to this container. Right? We are only inserting new HTML here inside of the container movements, but we are not overriding anything. And so actually that has to be the first thing that we do. So the first thing is to essentially empty the entire container, and only then we start adding new elements. So that's something common to do, and it is also not difficult at all. So container movements. And now we can use the inner HTML property, inner HTML, and set it to the empty string. And that's it. So this fixes our problem. All right. Now inner HTML here is a little bit similar to text content. So remember that. Now the difference is that text content simply returns the text itself, while HTML returns everything, including the HTML. So all the HTML tags will be included, okay? But here we are then using inner HTML as a setter. So just like we also used text content equal empty string or equal something else. Remember? So we used to do in our pick game, for example, like whatever and then text content and then set it to 0. Remember that? But as I said, we can also use this to read data. So let's simply log to the console just to understand this property, which is pretty important. So after all this, let's do container movements.inner HTML. So we're simply reading the inner HTML and then logging it to the console. So console, and indeed, here you see all of this HTML. All right. So essentially, that's the HTML that we just created. Okay. But let's get rid of this. I just wanted to show you both sides or both applications of inner HTML. All right. And finally, I wanted to show you why I used after begin and not before end. Well, let me show you what would happen with before end. I think this is how it works. So before end. Yeah. So with that, the order of the movements would be inverted. Okay. And that's because each new element would simply be added after the previous one. So at the end of the container, right? And so that's after all the child elements that are already in there. And that's why I wanted it to be the other way around. Because like this, it will always be basically appended to all the other children. So any new child element will appear before all the other child elements that were already there. And so now we are back to the order that we wanted here. All right, that's amazing. So we completed the first part of our user interface here already, and all with the power of the for each method. And then also we introduced some new concepts. In particular here, the insert adjacent HTML method, and then the inner HTML property. Now, there are many other ways of creating elements in JavaScript besides this one here, and we're going to study all of them in great detail in a future section. But this here is actually the one that I like the most. It's the easy, quick, and dirty solution, so to say. So all we have to do is to create a string of HTML, and then we can insert that simply with this method. So very simple, very straightforward. So this is some great DOM manipulation that we did right here, and I'm really happy about the result that we got here in our application. Great, so let's now move on. Welcome back to the first coding challenge of the arrays section. And in this one, Julia and Kate are doing a study on dogs. So each of them asked 5 dog owners about their dog's age, and then they stored that data into an array. And that's one array for each of them. All right? And in this study, they are interested in knowing whether each of the dogs is an adult or a puppy. And the rule is that a dog is an adult if it is at least 3 years old, and it's a puppy if it's less than 3 years old. And by the way, the test data here, so the arrays for each is down here, so test data 1 and 2. All right. So your task is to create a function called checkDogs, which accepts these 2 arrays and does the following things. So first, Julia found out that the owners of the first and the last 2 dogs do actually have cats and not dogs. So here, what I want you to do is to create a shallow copy of Julia's array and then remove the cat ages from the copied array. And you should copy it because it's a bad practice to mutate the parameters or the arguments of a function. Then, second, create an array with both Julia's and Kate's data. So for Julia, of course, the corrected data. And then for each of the dogs, simply log to the console whether it is an adult with a string like this or a puppy and then with a string like this. And that's, of course, according to the rules in the beginning. And then just run this function for both test data sets. And that's it. So all you need to do is to use the tools from all the lectures in this section so far, and then I think you will be fine solving this on your own. So this is really all about using the tools that we already learned before, and there's not a lot of new thinking to do here. So I hope you managed to do this one, and I see you back here in a second. All right. So hopefully you did this just fine without any problems. But I will anyway write my solution here and explain what I'm doing. So we accept the docs from Julia and the docs from Kate. And we will call this with the test data. And so Julia's data is this. And there's not a need to store them in separate variables. I will just call the function like this. All right. And now we should create a shallow copy of docs Julia so that we can then remove some elements from there. So docs Julia corrected dot slice. And so I'm using here the method and not the spread operator. And now I will simply remove some elements from there. So docs Julia corrected dot splice. And so it tells us that the first and the last two docs are not valid, basically. So the first is element number 0, and then we want to remove 1. So that's the first part. And then docs Julia corrected dot splice, and then the last two, which is -2. Okay. So let's take a look here simply at docs Julia corrected, just to see if this is correct, actually. So we need the console now. And so this was our beginning data. And indeed, the first and the last two are gone here. All right. Now, of course, you could have also done this in a different way, which is to simply copy the correct data from the original using the slice method. So something like this. Docs Julia dot slice. So starting from the second one and then all the way to the third one. Okay, and so this would give us the exact same result, but in this case, I just wanted to use the splice method. And in fact, I wanted you to use the splice method as well, and that's why I gave you that task like that. Anyway, we don't need this here anymore. Let's now simply create a new variable with both these docs. So simply calling it docs. And again, we could use the spread operator here, which I actually prefer. But since we are in the arrays section here, let's do everything with array methods. So that's the concat method, remember. And then we want to join the corrected Julia docs with docs Kate. So always a good idea to check. And yeah, that's correct. All right. And so all we have to do now is basically create this string. Let me just copy this string. And so looping over this array is now an easy task, hopefully. So docs.forEach, then the callback function. And one more time, we need actually the current element and also the index. And that's because here is the number, so doc number 1, and it's going to go all the way to 7. And so let's check out our rule. So a dog is an adult if he is at least 3 years old. So if dog is greater equal 3, then log a string like this. So here is the index plus 1. Here goes the dog itself. And then else is still a puppy. And here we need just this. And I think with this we are good. Let's just remove this. And yes, dog number 1 is 5 years old, so it's still an adult. Number 2 is 2 years old, so still a puppy. This is again a puppy with 1 year old. And so, yeah, that's the correct solution. Now let's just do it for this test data here. Then I'm gonna duplicate this one. Let's just comment out the first one. And okay, here we only have one puppy, which is the one before the last. And so this one is correct as well. And so, challenge completed.